The stars looked different when you knew aliens were watching you from them. Commander Tejo stood on the bridge of the new dawn and felt his stomach twist into knots that had nothing to do with the artificial gravity systems. 3 months ago, humanity had achieved faster than light travel, and now they were about to meet their first alien species. The diplomatic mission that everyone on Earth had dreamed about was finally happening, and Tejo wished he was anywhere else in the galaxy. Dr. Hyojin walked up beside him, carrying a tablet full of translation programs and linguistic analysis software that she had worked on for years. She was the best language expert humanity had, but even she looked nervous about trying to talk to beings from another world. Her dark hair was pulled back tight, and her hands shook just a little as she checked her equipment for the 100th time. Jinwoo was running final checks on the cultural analysis computers and trying to predict what kind of society they were about to encounter. He had studied every human civilization that ever existed, but alien minds might work in ways that no human brain could understand. The anthropologist kept muttering to himself about first contact protocols and hoping they would not accidentally start a war by saying hello wrong. The alien ship appeared on their screens like a massive crystal growing in the darkness of space. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, with surfaces that reflected starlight and patterns that hurt to look at directly. The ship was 10 times larger than the New Dawn and seemed to be made from some kind of living crystal that pulsed with inner light. When the communication channel opened, the sound that came through made everyone on the bridge cover their ears. It was like listening to music played on broken glass mixed with the screaming of metal being torn apart. Dr. Hee-jin worked frantically at her computers, trying to find patterns in the noise that might be language. The aliens called themselves the Vorthak, and their first message was clear even through the translation difficulties. They wanted the humans to come aboard their ship for what they called a diplomatic discussion. Tejo knew they had no choice but to accept, even though everything about the alien vessel seemed designed to make visitors feel small and helpless. Docking bay of the Vorthak ship was filled with creatures that looked like walking sculptures made from different colored crystals. They moved with clicking sounds that echoed off the walls, and their eyes were points of light that seemed to look right through human skin to examine what was underneath. The tallest of them stepped forward and spoke in a voice that sounded like wind chimes in a hurricane. High Arbiter Velthanor was clearly the leader, and he made no effort to hide his feelings about the human visitors. He looked at them the way a person might look at insects that had crawled out from under a rock. His crystal body shifted colors from blue to deep red as he spoke, and the translation computers struggled to keep up with words that seemed designed to express contempt. The Arbiter explained that the Vorthak Empire had been exploring the galaxy for thousands of years and had encountered many primitive species. Most of them were given the choice to become protected races under Vorthak guidance or face extinction. The way he said protected made it clear that he meant something much closer to slavery. Humanity was interesting to them only because humans had managed to achieve faster than light travel, despite being made of soft flesh instead of superior crystal. The Arbiter seemed to think this was some kind of accident or lucky mistake, rather than evidence of human intelligence and determination. Dr. Hyojin tried to establish better communication by showing the aliens human art and music and scientific discoveries. She explained how human civilization had developed across thousands of years and how they had learned to work together despite their differences. The Vorthak listened with what might have been polite attention, but their body language suggested they were humoring a child who was trying to explain something beyond their understanding. Jin Woo presented information about human culture and society, hoping to find common ground between the species. He talked about human values like cooperation and creativity and the drive to explore and learn new things. The aliens responded with harmonics that the translation computers identified as laughter, but it sounded more like crystal breaking than anything joyful. The Arbiter explained that the Vorthak had evolved beyond the need for individual thinking. Their crystal minds were linked together in a network that allowed them to share thoughts and knowledge instantly. They could not understand how beings trapped in separate bodies could accomplish anything meaningful. To them, humans were like deaf people trying to participate in a conversation they could not hear. When Tejo tried to explain human achievements in science and exploration and art, the Arbiter waved a crystalline appendage dismissively. He said that flesh creatures might stumble onto useful discoveries by accident, but they lacked the mental clarity that came from true evolutionary advancement. The Vorthak saw themselves as the natural rulers of the galaxy, because their crystal, bodies and networked minds made them superior to all other forms of life. The meeting continued for hours with the humans trying to prove their worth, and the aliens growing more impatient with each attempt. Everything humanity offered as evidence of their civilization was dismissed as primitive or accidental. The Vorthak had technology that could reshape matter at the molecular level, and weapons that could crack planets like eggs. They had explored most of the galaxy and conquered or absorbed dozens of other species. Dr. Heejin noticed something strange about the Vorthak language during the translation process. Hidden in their words were mathematical patterns that seemed familiar, but she could not place where she had seen them before. The patterns were too complex and regular to be accidental, and they appeared consistently throughout Vorthak's speech. She made careful notes while trying not to let the aliens see what she was doing. The Arbiter finally grew tired of what he saw as pointless discussion. He told the humans that they had one choice to make, and the decision would determine the future of their entire species. They could accept Vorthak protection and guidance, which meant giving up their independence and becoming a client race. Human technology and resources would be managed by Vorthak overseers, and human reproduction would be controlled to prevent overpopulation. The alternative was simple and final. The Vorthak would classify humanity as a threat to galactic stability and eliminate them completely. Their crystal weapons could turn Earth into cosmic dust in a matter of hours, and no human technology could stop them. The choice was slavery or death, and they had exactly one solar cycle to decide. Taeho felt his blood turn to ice as he realized that first contact had become a death sentence for his entire species. The aliens were not interested in friendship or trade or cultural exchange. They saw humans as either useful servants or dangerous pests to be eliminated. There was no middle ground and no room for negotiation. The meeting ended with the humans being escorted back to their ship, while the Arbiter made it clear that any attempt to flee or call for help would be seen as a hostile act. The Vorthak would be monitoring all human communications and tracking every human ship. Earth was effectively under siege by an enemy that could destroy them without breaking a sweat. As the new dawn pulled away from the crystal ship, Dr. Heejin stared at her notes about the strange mathematical patterns in Vorthak speech. Something about those numbers felt important, but she could not figure out what they meant or why they seemed so familiar. The fate of humanity might depend on solving that puzzle before the alien deadline expired. The journey back to Earth felt like a funeral march with everyone on board, knowing they were carrying news that would terrify their entire species. The most advanced civilization humanity had ever imagined had just told them to choose between slavery and extinction. The universe was a much darker and more dangerous place than anyone had dared to imagine. Taeho looked out at the stars one more time and wondered if humanity would still exist to see them after the Vorthak deadline passed. The aliens had called them savages who had barely crawled out of their caves, but maybe there was something about being human that the crystal beings had missed. Maybe flesh and blood could find a way to survive when crystal and logic had already decided their fate. Earth had never seen panic like this before. The news of the Vorthak ultimatum spread across the planet in hours, and every government on Earth was scrambling to find solutions to an impossible problem. Military leaders talked about building weapons and defenses, but everyone knew that human technology was thousands of years behind what the crystal aliens possessed. You cannot fight enemies who can shatter moons when your best weapons barely scratch their armor. Dr. Heejin had not slept since returning from the alien ship, and her laboratory looked like a tornado had hit it. Papers covered every surface with mathematical equations and linguistic analyses scattered everywhere. She had been working nonstop trying to decode the strange patterns she had noticed in Vorthak speech, but the numbers seemed to dance away from understanding every time she got close to an answer. Dong Hyun was the best mathematician on the planet, and he stared at the equations with growing excitement mixed with confusion. The patterns that Dr. Heejin had found were not random, and they were definitely not accidental. They followed rules that were more complex than anything in human mathematics, but somehow they felt familiar, like half-remembered songs from childhood so young. Arrived at the laboratory carrying boxes of archaeological data that she had pulled from university archives all over the world. She was an expert on ancient human civilizations, and something about the alien mathematical patterns reminded her of symbols she had seen carved into stone monuments that were thousands of years old. The connection seemed impossible, but the similarities were too strong to ignore. Captain Yunseo was coordinating Earth's military response from a command center that had been built deep underground. She knew that preparing for war against the Vorthak was probably useless, but humans had to try something. Every military unit on the planet was being mobilized, and weapons factories were running at maximum capacity, even though their best efforts would be like throwing rocks at a battleship. Admiral Kyung-ho was in charge of Earth's space defenses, and he spent his days looking at tactical displays that showed just how hopeless their situation really was. Human ships were tiny compared to Vorthak vessels, and human weapons could barely scratch alien crystal armor. The space defense network that had seemed so impressive last month now looked like a child's toy compared to what they were facing. The breakthrough came when So Young was comparing alien mathematical patterns to ancient Korean astronomical texts that had been written over 1,000 years ago. The symbols were different, but the underlying mathematical relationships were identical. She called Dr. Hee-jin and Dong-hyun over to look at what she had found, and all three of them stared at the evidence in stunned silence. The ancient texts contained the same complex mathematical sequences that appeared in Vorthak language, but the Korean astronomers who had written them could not possibly have known about alien mathematics. The texts were definitely authentic and had been carbon dated to prove their age. There was no way that ancient humans could have copied alien mathematical systems that they had never encountered. Dr. Minho was a physicist who specialized in studying dimensional mathematics, and when he saw the patterns, he immediately recognized what they were looking at. These were not just mathematical sequences, but instructions for manipulating space and time at the quantum level. The equations described ways to bend reality itself, using nothing but properly structured mathematical relationships. The team worked through the night comparing ancient human texts with alien linguistic patterns and found matches everywhere they looked. Cave paintings from France contained the same mathematical relationships as Vorthak communication protocols. Stone circles in England were built using geometric principles that matched alien technology designs. Ancient temples in Egypt and Peru used architectural ratios that were identical to Vorthak crystal growth patterns. So Young brought in more archaeological evidence from civilizations all over the world, and every ancient culture seemed to have preserved fragments of the same mathematical knowledge. The Mayans had calendars that used the same time calculation methods as Vorthak navigation systems. Aboriginal Australian art contained geometric patterns that matched alien energy manipulation techniques. Chinese texts from 2,000 years ago described mathematical principles that the Vorthak used for faster-than-light communication. The implications were staggering and terrifying at the same time. Ancient humans had somehow possessed knowledge that even the advanced Vorthak civilization treated as almost magical. The mathematical patterns were not just random symbols, but parts of a language that could control the fundamental forces of reality itself. Dr. Hye-jin realized that the Vorthak had mentioned something during their first meeting that she had not paid attention to at the time. The Arbiter had talked about their creators called the Architects, who had vanished millions of years ago, leaving behind only fragments of their advanced technology. The Vorthak worshipped these architects as gods and spent their entire civilization trying to understand the knowledge their creators had left behind. The terrible and wonderful truth was becoming clear. The mathematical patterns in Vorthak speech were not originally Vorthak at all, but remnants of their creators' language that they had preserved and tried to understand. The architects had been the source of the advanced mathematics, and somehow, ancient humans on Earth had also encountered these beings and learned fragments of their knowledge. So Young found more evidence in archaeological records from around the world. Ancient texts described visitors from the stars who taught humans about mathematics and astronomy and architecture. The descriptions varied between cultures, but they all mentioned beings who could speak words that changed the world around them, and who left behind knowledge that humans were supposed to preserve until the right time came to use it. Dr. Minho began working with computer specialist Ji Hoon to reconstruct what the complete mathematical language might have looked like. If ancient humans had preserved fragments of this knowledge, then it might be possible to piece together enough of the original language to understand how it worked. The architects had apparently created a form of mathematics that was also a spoken language that could manipulate reality at the quantum level. The work was dangerous because even small mistakes in the calculations could have unpredictable effects on local spacetime. Dr. Young-suk joined the team to help with quantum physics calculations and to make sure that their experiments did not accidentally tear holes in reality or create localized time distortions that could destroy the laboratory as they worked to decode more of the ancient mathematical language. The team realized that they were looking at something that was part science and part magic and part divine communication all at the same time. The architects had apparently created a way to speak reality into different shapes using mathematical principles that were beyond anything that modern human science had imagined possible. Captain Yoon Seo volunteered to be the first test subject. When the team was ready to try speaking some of the reconstructed language fragments, she was a military officer who understood the risks of experimental technology, and she was willing to take chances that civilians might not be prepared for. The testing would be dangerous, but if the ancient language really worked, then it might give humanity a way to defend itself against the Vorthak. The first test was scheduled for the day before the alien deadline expired. Dr. Haijin and her team had reconstructed what they believed were simple command phrases in the architect language, based on mathematical patterns found in ancient human texts from around the world. They had no idea if their translations were correct or if speaking the ancient words would have any effect at all. Time was running out and humanity was about to discover whether ancient humans had preserved the key to their survival, or whether they were about to destroy themselves trying to speak in the tongue of gods. The Vorthak deadline was approaching, and Earth's fate would be decided by whether flesh and blood could master a language that crystal beings worshipped but could not fully understand. The laboratory was ready, and Captain Yoon Seo was prepared to risk her life speaking words that had not been heard on Earth for thousands of years. Outside the laboratory, the world held its breath, waiting to see if humanity would find salvation in ancient knowledge, or if they would face extinction at the hands of aliens who called them primitive savages. The moment of truth was approaching, and everything would change forever. Captain Yoon Seo stood in the center of the laboratory, surrounded by monitoring equipment that would record every aspect of what was about to happen. The reconstructed phrase that Dr. Haijin had translated was carved into stone tablets that were over 3,000 years old and found in a temple complex in Korea that had been abandoned long before recorded history began. The mathematical patterns hidden in the ancient symbols matched Vorthak linguistic structures perfectly, but nobody knew what would happen when a human being tried to speak words that had been silent for millennia. Dr. Haijin checked her translation one more time and nodded to Captain Yoon Seo, who took a deep breath and spoke the first words in the architect language that any human had attempted in thousands of years. The sounds that came from her mouth were unlike anything in any human language, with harmonics that seemed to vibrate in dimensions that normal sound could not reach. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The air around Captain Yoon Seo began to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer pavement, and the monitoring equipment started recording energy readings that should have been impossible. Her voice carried undertones that made the walls of the laboratory vibrate, and the lights flickered as if the building's electrical systems were struggling to cope with forces they were never designed to handle. So Young watched in amazement as small objects near Captain Yoon Seo began to change shape without being touched. A metal pen twisted itself into a perfect spiral, and a coffee cup reformed itself into a crystalline structure that looked almost like Vorthak technology. The ancient language was not just communication but a form of applied physics that could restructure matter at the molecular level by using properly arranged mathematical relationships. Dr. Minho's instruments detected fluctuations in local space-time that meant the spoken words were actually bending reality around them. The architect language worked by using mathematical harmonics to convince the universe to rearrange itself according to different rules. It was technology disguised as language, or maybe language that had evolved into technology over millions of years of development. The test lasted only 30 seconds, but when Captain Yoon Seo stopped speaking, the laboratory looked like a completely different place. Surfaces had been transformed into new materials that reflected light in impossible ways, and the air itself seemed to hum with residual energy that made everyone's skin tingle. They had proven that the ancient language worked, but they had barely scratched the surface of understanding how powerful it really was. Dr. Haijin realized that if humans could master even a small portion of this linguistic technology, they might have a chance against the Vorthak ultimatum. The aliens worshipped the architects as gods and treated their language as sacred knowledge that had been lost for millions of years. If humans could demonstrate mastery of the god speech, then maybe the crystal beings would reconsider their plans for conquest and extinction. The team worked frantically through the remaining hours before the Vorthak deadline, trying to reconstruct more complex phrases and commands from the ancient fragments they had discovered. So Young found archaeological evidence from sites all over the world that contained pieces of the same mathematical language system. Ancient humans had apparently been taught by the architects and had preserved their knowledge in stone carvings and oral traditions and sacred texts that had survived for thousands of years. Ji-hoon modified the translation computers to help decode longer passages of the ancient language, while Dr. Young-suk calculated the quantum mechanical effects of different phrase combinations. They were essentially learning to speak in equations that could rewrite the laws of physics within localized areas of spacetime. Every word had to be pronounced with mathematical precision, or the results could be catastrophically unpredictable. Commander Tae-ho arrived at the laboratory as the team was preparing for the final test that would determine humanity's fate. The Vorthak ships had moved into position around Earth and were waiting for humanity's answer to their ultimatum: surrender and accept slavery or face complete extinction within hours of the deadline expiring. There were no other options and no room for negotiation. The plan was simple and desperate. Commander Tae-ho would return to the Vorthak ship and attempt to demonstrate human mastery of the architect language. If the translation work was correct, and if he could pronounce the ancient words properly, then maybe the aliens would recognize that humans were not primitive savages, but inheritors of the same divine knowledge that the Vorthak themselves worshipped. Dr. Hee-jin had identified several phrases that appeared to be formal greetings and statements of authority in the architect language. The mathematical pattern suggested these were words that had been used by the architects to establish their credentials when dealing with other advanced civilizations. If spoken correctly, they should prove that the speaker had legitimate knowledge of the god speech. The journey back to the Vorthak ship felt like riding to an execution, but Commander Tae-ho was humanity's only hope for survival. He practiced the ancient phrases during the flight while trying to ignore the fact that mispronouncing even a single syllable could have consequences that nobody could predict. The architect language was more powerful than nuclear weapons and potentially more dangerous if used incorrectly. High Arbiter Velthanor was waiting in the same crystal chamber where the first meeting had taken place. But his attitude was different now. The aliens had been monitoring human communications and they knew that something unusual was happening on Earth. Vorthak sensors had detected energy readings that matched patterns from their most ancient and sacred texts. The Arbiter demanded to know what humanity had decided about the ultimatum, but Commander Tae-ho ignored the question and began to speak in the reconstructed architect language. The sounds that came from his mouth made every Vorthak in the chamber freeze in what could only be described as religious terror mixed with impossible hope. The effect on the aliens was immediate and dramatic. Their crystal bodies began to resonate with harmonics that they had not produced in millions of years, and their networked minds were suddenly flooded with racial memories that they had thought were lost forever. The words that the human was speaking were in the language of their creators, and the mathematical patterns were perfect replications of sounds that had not been heard since the architects vanished from the galaxy High Arbiter Velthanor's crystal. Form shifted through colors that had no names as he struggled to process what he was hearing. The primitive flesh creature was speaking the god speech, with fluency that even the most advanced Vorthak scholars had never achieved. It was impossible according to everything they knew about the universe. But the evidence was resonating through every crystal in their bodies. Commander Tae-ho continued speaking in the ancient language while the Vorthak chamber erupted into chaos. Some of the aliens fell into states that looked like religious ecstasy, while others began generating alarm harmonics that suggested they thought they were witnessing either a miracle or the end of the world. The crystal beings had spent millions of years trying to reconstruct fragments of their creator's language, and now a species they had dismissed as savages was speaking it fluently. The demonstration lasted for several minutes, during which Commander Tae-ho spoke phrases that Dr. Hee-jin had translated from ancient human texts found on every continent on Earth. He was essentially proving that humanity had preserved knowledge that the Vorthak had lost, and that humans were not primitive creatures who had stumbled onto space travel by accident. When Commander Tae-ho finished speaking, the silence in the crystal chamber was complete. Every Vorthak present was staring at him with optical sensors that blazed with light patterns that their translation computers could not interpret. The aliens were experiencing something that their species had not felt for millions of years, and they had no words in their own language to describe what they were thinking. High Arbiter Velthanor finally managed to speak, but his voice was completely different from the arrogant tone he had used during the first meeting. He asked Commander Tae-ho where humans had learned the sacred language and how long they had possessed knowledge that the Vorthak had been seeking since their creators disappeared from the galaxy. The answer changed everything. Commander Tae-ho explained that ancient humans had been taught by the architects thousands of years ago and had preserved fragments of their knowledge in stone monuments and sacred texts and oral traditions that had been passed down through generations. Earth was not just another primitive world, but a repository of divine knowledge that had been waiting for the right time to be revealed. The Vorthak ultimatum was forgotten as High Arbiter Velthanor and his followers struggled to understand the implications of what they had just witnessed. The flesh creatures they had been planning to enslave or exterminate were actually the keepers of sacred knowledge that the crystal beings had spent their entire civilization trying to recover. Everything had changed and nothing would ever be the same again. The Vorthak fleet hung motionless around Earth as their entire civilization tried to process what had just happened in High Arbiter Velthanor's chamber. Commander Tae-ho had spoken words in the God speech that made every crystal being in the galaxy feel tremors through their networked consciousness. The impossible had become reality, and the primitive flesh creatures had proven themselves to be inheritors of sacred knowledge that the Vorthak had worshipped for millions of years without truly understanding. Dr. Hye-jin received emergency communications from the alien fleet as Vorthak scholars desperately tried to understand how humans had learned the architect language. She found herself in the unprecedented position of teaching alien scientists about mathematical relationships that their own species had preserved but never fully comprehended. The ancient patterns that humans had carved in stone were more complete than anything in Vorthak historical records. High Arbiter Velthanor was no longer the arrogant leader who had threatened humanity with extinction. His crystal form flickered through color patterns that indicated deep confusion, mixed with something that might have been reverence. He had spent his entire existence believing that the Vorthak were the most advanced species in the galaxy, and now he was forced to accept that flesh beings had preserved divine knowledge that his people had lost. The Vorthak civilization began to split into factions as news of the human demonstration spread through their networked consciousness. The awakened believed that humanity represented the return of the flesh-bearers mentioned in their most ancient prophecies. These aliens began treating humans as sacred beings who had been chosen by the architects to preserve their divine language, until the right time came to reveal it. The purists refused to accept that primitive creatures could possess knowledge superior to Vorthak understanding. They insisted that the humans had somehow stolen or corrupted fragments of the God speech and were using it blasphemously. Warshard Kethmore became the leader of this faction and began preparing for a holy war to cleanse the galaxy of the flesh, creatures who dared to speak in the tongue of gods. Back on Earth, the human team was working frantically to decode more of the architect language while trying to understand the full implications of what they had discovered. So Young found evidence in archaeological records that suggested the architects had not just visited Earth, but had actually lived among ancient humans for extended periods. Cave paintings from around the world showed tall figures teaching humans about mathematics and astronomy and architecture. Jinwoo realized that many human cultural and religious traditions contained memories of the architect visitation that had been transformed into myths and legends over thousands of years. Stories about gods who came down from heaven to teach humanity were actually historical records of first contact with beings who possessed technology that seemed magical to primitive humans. Dr. Minho and Dr. Young-suk discovered that the architect language was based on quantum mechanical principles that human science was only beginning to understand. The ancient beings had created a form of communication that worked by manipulating probability waves at the subatomic level. Speaking the God speech correctly required understanding mathematics that described how reality worked at its most fundamental level. Captain Yoon Seo volunteered to undergo more extensive training in the architect language, and soon discovered that prolonged exposure to the God speech was changing her in ways that nobody had anticipated. Her voice began to carry harmonics that could influence matter and energy directly, and her understanding of mathematical relationships became almost intuitive rather than purely analytical. Engineer Seo Jin joined the project and found that combining human engineering intuition with architect mathematical principles could create technologies that pure logic alone could never achieve. She began designing devices that used spoken commands in the God speech to control their operation. The results were machines that seemed to respond to the intentions of their operators rather than just mechanical input. The breakthrough in understanding came when Dr. Haijin realized that the Vorthak had been approaching the architect language incorrectly for millions of years. They had treated it as a purely technical system that could be decoded through logic and analysis. But the God speech required intuition and creativity that crystalline minds had difficulty developing. Flesh and blood consciousness was actually better suited to mastering the divine language than crystal-based intelligence. This revelation explained why ancient humans had been chosen as keepers of the architect knowledge. The flesh beings who seemed primitive compared to crystal technology actually possessed mental flexibility that made them ideal students of the God speech. Human creativity and adaptability were advantages rather than weaknesses when it came to learning the language of God. Scholar Jin Wu demonstrated this principle by teaching the God speech to other humans and finding that each person developed their own unique way of understanding and using the ancient language. Humans could improvise and adapt the mathematical principles in ways that the rigid Vorthak consciousness could never match. What looked like chaos to crystal minds was actually the creative flexibility that the architects had built into their linguistic system. The Vorthak awakened faction began sending delegations to Earth requesting permission to study human methods of learning the God speech. They wanted to understand how flesh consciousness could master divine knowledge that had eluded their crystal intelligence for millions of years. These aliens were willing to accept humans as teachers rather than subjects. High Arbiter Velthanor underwent what could only be described as a spiritual crisis as he tried to reconcile his lifelong beliefs with the evidence of human mastery of sacred knowledge. He had built his identity around Vorthak superiority, and now he was forced to admit that the species he had dismissed as savages were actually closer to the architects than his own people had ever been. The purist faction under Warshard Kethmore refused to accept the new reality and began preparing for military action against Earth. They convinced themselves that destroying the blasphemous humans would restore proper order to the galaxy and prevent the corruption of sacred knowledge by unworthy flesh creatures. Kethmore gathered a fleet of the most fanatical Vorthak warriors, who were willing to die rather than accept human equality. Commander Teho found himself in the impossible position of being a diplomatic bridge between species that were on the verge of civil war. The awakened Vorthak wanted to learn from humanity, while the purists wanted to destroy them completely. Earth was caught in the middle of an alien religious conflict that had been triggered by human mastery of divine language. Dr. Hye Jin worked with awakened Vorthak scholars to decode more complex passages from the architect language, and discovered references to something called the Great Awakening that would occur when the flesh-bearers returned the lost words to the galaxy. The ancient text suggested that this event would transform not just the Vorthak, but all intelligent species in ways that nobody could predict. The situation was becoming more dangerous as the purist faction grew more fanatical, and Warshard Kethmore began making threats against any Vorthak who collaborated with the human blasphemers. The crystal beings were dividing into two incompatible groups, and violence seemed inevitable, as both sides prepared for a conflict that would determine the future of galactic civilization. Time was running out as the purist fleet moved into attack position around Earth, while the awakened Vorthak tried desperately to prevent a war that would destroy the very beings they now considered sacred. Humanity had awakened something in the alien consciousness that could not be controlled or contained, and the consequences were spreading across the galaxy like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. The revelation had become a revolution, and nothing would ever be simple again. Warshard Kethmore's purist fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of Earth's solar system, with weapons that could crack planets and a fanatical determination to cleanse the galaxy of blasphemous flesh creatures. The crystal ships moved like deadly geometric sculptures through space with their hull surfaces reflecting starlight, in patterns that hurt human eyes to look at directly. Each vessel carried enough firepower to devastate continents, and Kethmore had brought enough ships to turn Earth into cosmic dust within hours. The Warshard had decided that destroying the human homeworld was the only way to restore proper religious order to the Vorthak civilization. Captain Yun Seo stood on the bridge of humanity's flagship and watched the alien armada approach with weapons that made human technology look like stone knives compared to laser cannons. But she was no longer the same person who had volunteered for the first God speech experiments weeks ago. Extended training in the architect language had changed her in ways that even she did not fully understand. Her voice could now speak commands that convinced reality to rearrange itself according to different mathematical principles. She had become what the ancient texts called a voice walker, who could step between dimensions using nothing but properly pronounced equations. The God speech had awakened abilities in her mind that humans had possessed thousands of years ago, and then forgotten until now. Admiral Kyung-ho coordinated the defense of Earth from a command center that looked more like an ancient temple than a military facility. Human engineers had learned to combine their technology with architect mathematical principles, and the results were weapons and shields that operated according to rules that conventional physics could not explain. The human fleet that rose to meet. The purest attack was tiny compared to the Crystal Armada, but every ship was now guided by officers who could speak reality into new shapes. The vessels themselves had been rebuilt using God speech construction techniques that made their hulls stronger than anything that pure engineering could create. Dr. He-jin worked frantically with awakened Vorthak scholars to find peaceful solutions, while Warshard Kethmore's fleet moved closer to Earth. The purist leader had declared that any crystal being who collaborated with the flesh creatures was a traitor to their entire species and would be destroyed along with the humans. The ancient alliance between different Vorthak factions had shattered completely. The first engagement began when purist ships opened fire on awakened Vorthak vessels that were trying to shield Earth from attack. Crystal weapons that could shatter moons struck crystal armor that had been reinforced with human intuition and architect mathematics. The battle that followed was part conventional warfare and part theological debate fought with weapons that could rewrite local physics. Captain Yun Seo led a squadron of human ships into the center of the alien battle and began speaking God speech commands that turned enemy missiles into clouds of harmless particles. Her voice carried across the vacuum of space using mathematical harmonics that treated the absence of atmosphere as just another engineering challenge to overcome through properly applied divine language. The purist fleet found themselves fighting enemies who could speak their weapons into different shapes and convince their shields to become more solid than the attacks that struck them. Human officers who had been trained in the architect language could command their ships using voice alone, and the vessels responded as if they were living creatures rather than mechanical constructs. Warshard Kethmore realized that conventional tactics would not work against opponents who could rewrite the rules of physics during combat. He ordered his fleet to concentrate their fire on Earth itself, hoping to destroy the source of the blasphemous knowledge before it could spread further throughout the galaxy. The moment that defined everything came when young Haiwan stepped onto the observation deck of the orbital defense station and looked out at the purist fleet that was preparing to murder her entire species. She was barely 20 years old and had learned the God speech faster than anyone else in the human training program. Her understanding of the architect language was so intuitive that she could speak mathematical equations like poetry. What Haiwan did next would be remembered for as long as intelligent life existed in the galaxy. She began to speak the deepest level of God speech that humans had discovered in their ancient texts. These were the creation words that the architects had used to bring matter into existence from pure mathematical possibility. Her voice carried harmonics that convinced empty space to condense into solid reality, according to patterns that she described in divine language. The purest weapons that had been aimed at Earth suddenly found themselves striking gardens of living crystal that sang with harmonies that expressed the mathematical relationships between all forms of intelligent life. Haiwan had not destroyed the enemy missiles, but had transformed them into artistic expressions of unity between flesh and crystal consciousness. The effect on Warshard Kethmore and his purist followers was immediate and overwhelming. They had spent their entire existence believing that the god speech was too sacred for flesh creatures to possess. But now they were witnessing a human child speak creation words that even the most advanced Vorthak scholars had never mastered. The mathematical beauty of what she had accomplished was undeniable proof that the architects had chosen wisely when they selected humans as keepers of divine knowledge. The purest fleet stopped attacking as crystal warriors who had been prepared to die for their beliefs found themselves experiencing religious awakening that shattered everything they thought they knew about the universe. Warshard Kethmore himself underwent a transformation that could only be described as spiritual rebirth, as he realized that his entire understanding of sacred truth had been incomplete. High Arbiter Velthanor spoke to the combined fleets using communication channels that carried his words to every Vorthak consciousness in the galaxy. He formally acknowledged that humans were the flesh-bearers mentioned in ancient prophecies, and that the species his people had dismissed as primitive savages were actually inheritors of divine knowledge that the Vorthak had been seeking for millions of years. The war ended not with victory or defeat, but with recognition and acceptance. The crystal beings who had called humans savages now understood that flesh and blood consciousness possessed capabilities that their own crystal intelligence could never achieve. The creative flexibility that had seemed like weakness was actually the quality that made humans ideal students of the architect language. Commander Te-Ho found himself addressing a joint assembly of human and Vorthak representatives as the two species began working together to decode more of the ancient knowledge that Earth had preserved. The alliance was built on mutual respect rather than conquest or submission, as both flesh and crystal consciousness contributed their unique strengths to understanding divine truth. Scholar Jin Wu established the first interspecies university, where humans taught Vorthak students about intuitive approaches to the god speech, while crystal scholars shared their mathematical precision with human researchers. The combination of flesh creativity and crystal logic produced insights into the architect language that neither species could have achieved alone. Dr. Hye Jin became the director of the Galactic Institute for Divine Linguistics, where researchers from dozens of species worked together to reconstruct the complete architect language system. Each new discovery revealed more about the ancient beings who had created a form of communication that could reshape reality itself through properly structured mathematical relationships. Captain Yoon Seo was given the title Voice Walker Prime and tasked with training the next generation of humans who would learn to speak in the tongue of gods. The god speech was no longer a lost language but a living system of communication that connected all forms of intelligent life to the mathematical principles that governed existence. The galaxy had been transformed by the discovery that primitive humans had preserved knowledge that advanced civilizations had lost. The species that had been dismissed as flesh creatures crawling out of caves had proven themselves to be the bridge between the physical universe and the mathematical realm, where gods and mortals could speak as equals. Humanity had found its place among the stars, not as conquerors or subjects, but as teachers and students in a cosmic classroom, where the curriculum was written in the language of creation itself. The Vorthak, who had once threatened extinction, now served as partners in exploring mysteries that were older than their combined civilizations. The ancient words carved in human stone had awakened possibilities that would reshape the galaxy for millions of years to come. Flesh and crystal consciousness working together had accomplished what neither could achieve alone, and the universe itself was richer for their cooperation. High Arbiter Velthanor stood beside Commander Te-Ho, looking out at the stars that no longer seemed cold and distant but warm with the promise of discoveries yet to be made. The crystal being who had once called humans savages now considered them to be among his closest friends and most respected teachers. The god speech continued to reveal new secrets as more humans learned to speak mathematical equations with the fluency of native speakers.